welcome Dr. Christopher Roberts to discuss the life and work of Lorenzo Johnston Greene, who wrote one of the first extensive texts on Black life in the region, publishing The Negro in Colonial New England in 1942. Dr. Roberts will speak on both Greene's scholarly contributions to the study of Black history broadly, as well as his groundbreaking study of Black life in New England specifically. This program is generously sponsored by the Jarzambek family, and that is Mark Jarzambek and Michelle Drum, and we're very grateful for their support for the entire slate of programming for Black History Month in this year, 2022. Now, Dr. Roberts is a very distinguished speaker. He is Assistant Professor of Theory and History of Art and Design and Experimental Foundation Studies at the Rhode Island School of Design. He earned a PhD in Africology and African American Studies from Temple University and an MA in Ethnic Studies from San Francisco State University. He examines Black geographies of memory and forgetting, with an emphasis on port cities in the U.S. that anchored the transatlantic and domestic slave trades. His current manuscript project proposes an alternative episteme through which we can unsettle the anti-Blackness and geographic imperialism inherent in the monumental landscape of the U.S. via robust archival field and digital humanities research that analyzes Confederate monuments and African burial grounds in the U.S. American South. So you may recall he gave a great lecture last year. So we are very, very happy to welcome him this evening. So thank you all for joining us. And Dr. Roberts, take it from here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Benedict, for that gracious introduction. Thank you to Julia and the entire staff over at the Redwood Library in Athenæum. I am very, very appreciative and thankful for the opportunity. Before I begin, I would just like to thank those who've laid the path for me to be here. I would like to thank, my family, my ancestors, the sort of teachers, mentors, guides, support system that has been sort of helping me throughout the entirety of this process. And I hope to do the help that they've provided me justice in this presentation. So that would be where I would like to begin. So I also see that Sylvia's in the chat. I just want to say hi, good to see you. I hope that your Lincoln brethren, who I speak about today, I get to share some information about him. So that would be great. Yeah, so let's pull up the presentation and get to it. So let's see. All right, share and view slideshow. All right, so we should be good to go. Everyone at this point should see the slide, and I'm going to start with just a sort of brief discussion about a term that came up in my studying of Dr. Greene that proved to be interesting and meaningful. Hold on one second. So he had this phrase that was said, indelibly stamped upon me. And it's a way that he discusses his entry into the field of African-American history, his entry into the sort of profession, but ultimately he and Dr. Woodson, who was his noted mentor, that, as Benedict stated, I spoke about last year, they often use this phrase, this term, the cause, when they spoke about their work, and particularly the cause being a sort of focus and a serious engagement of African-American history. And the cause, in short, was a sort of unspoken shorthand, or a sort of briefly spoken shorthand between them. And in describing why he remained so dedicated throughout his life to African-American history and sort of Black colleges and universities, in his case, Lincoln University in Missouri, what sort of remained clear was a sort of ardent, consistent interest in this cause. So in the spirit of Dr. Greene, I hope to do the cause justice today. A little bit about Dr. Greene. He was born November 6th, 1899. In terms of his education, he attended Ansonia High School in Connecticut, then attended Howard University, and then Columbia University. His employment, in some ways, is very, very dynamic and vast. So, for example, he didn't go straight to college. After graduating from Ansonia, Greene came from a large family, a family where all of the other siblings prior to him, he was the eighth child of 9, and all of his siblings prior to him had taken up work after schooling. None had gone on to college up until that point. And due to needing to provide for the family immediately after graduating high school, he did not either. In fact, he did jobs such as sawing wood, cutting grass, and a series of factory jobs, delivery jobs, and other odds and ends as well. Ultimately, though, after a few years, he did end up at Howard University. In terms of teaching, in terms of sort of professional work or academic jobs, there are really two that were sort of paramount in his life. One would be working for the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, now known as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and then taking a professorship at Lincoln University in Missouri. So there are a few texts that kind of give us a window into his life and kind of outline who Lorenzo Johnston Greene was, who Dr. Greene was. And as you'll notice from the book cover here, I'll sort of highlight some of the main texts that I wanted to focus on today, sort of to the right of the text. So you should be able to see those. In this first book, The Early Black History Movement, Carter G. Woodson and Lorenzo Johnston Greene, by Perogago Degbovi, Dr. Degbovi. And one of the things that I think is crucial to understand as we sort of engage in this conversation is that this presentation, this sort of line of study might best be understood within the framework that Dr. Greg Carr over at Howard University and others have referred to as intellectual genealogy, particularly Black intellectual genealogy. And it's imperative to think about that because we don't get a Dr. Greene without a Dr. Woodson, but we get neither without a Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. And the sort of intellectual atmosphere of the late 19th and early 20th century as it pertains to African Americans is crucial if one is to understand the world or the backdrop within which people like this emerged. So where I might start with in terms of Degbovi and in terms of Greene is in terms of his family. So he grew up in a working class family, as I said, one of 9 children, and his upbringing was not one that enjoyed sort of a lot of wealth, a lot of status. In fact, there are in Degbovi's text references to a situation where he actually had to wear his sister's old shoes and his mother's old shoes sometimes to go to school. There's also mention of him at certain points wearing a deceased female cousin's winter clothing and coat to school as well. And I sort of highlight this really just to pinpoint the sort of hardships that Greene dealt with growing on early up. And what Degbovi says that's significant about sort of the financial hardships in particular are that, quote, unlike many Black doctoral scholars featured in Horace Mann Bond's 1972 study, Greene did not come from a privileged background. His family and the community as a whole supported young Rennie's, what they called him, quest for an education during the hardest times. Greene's early years were ones of hardship, some of as I've mentioned and highlighted. So if we sort of think about this within the historical context, many of the sort of Black academic class of, again, that late 19th, early 20th century period, not all, but many were those whose families' status afforded them sort of means, opportunity, and time to pursue research, to pursue study as something worthwhile instead of sort of a more traditional job. And I'll get into that a bit later. Secondly, is this idea of the progressive era, being the period that Greene sort of is born into and coming out of. And it's interesting to think about how this period in some ways is called, quote, the progressive era, yet very little about it was progressive for Black people. And Bovey sort of highlights multiple instances of how this sort of contradiction of terms is particularly salient when one is looking at the experiences and perspectives of Black people. A third point in terms of understanding sort of how we get to and how we arrived at Dr. Greene sort of being this very sort of prominent and central figure is this idea of, quote, the corrective principle. Now, Bovey dives into this by saying, quote, African-American historians before Greene's times accepted the responsibility of writing Blacks into American history and correcting racist scholarship. A classic example of African-American historians embracing what Manning Marable has deemed the, quote, corrective principle of Black intellectual tradition, which was Du Bois and Woodson's responses to U.B. Phillips's famous American Negro slavery. The first two African-American PhDs in history critiqued Phillips's portrayal of African-Americans as being, quote, ignorant, quote, unenterprising, quote, barbaric, and, quote, childlike and credulous in the, quote, ways of civilization. And that sort of becomes really important if one is to think about how certain scholars emerge and what sort of comes up to be the way that they write. And something that you may notice, if anyone on the call here is a student of African-American history or Black history, something that you'll be quite familiar with is the sort of abundance of titles with the first word, the or the. And particularly I'm talking about between, I would say, sort of the mid 1800s and the mid 1900s. For about that period of a century, you have, whether it's Harold Cruz's The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, whether it's Benjamin Quarles's The Negro in America, whether it is Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, or whether it is Lorenzo Johnston Greene's The Negro in Colonial New England. And the sort of preponderance of the or the text is in many ways an example of people attempting to do this work of the, quote, corrective principle, or to do this work that is sort of to set the history straight, right? That the sort of the misrepresentative propaganda of a sort of Eurocentric and white supremacist education system has misrepresented who Black people are, who African people are. So there was an abundance of Black scholars who set to put out the correct history or correctives to this. And I think that we are now, call it, 70, 80 years, in some cases 100 years past this initial corrective movement. Many of the contemporary scholars now have sort of an awareness or understanding that instead of there perhaps being, quote, the history, there are sort of a myriad perspectives. There are the histories or multiple perspectives. However, I want to caution folks before if they're being sort of too critical of the move to the singular that emerged in this period, because it's very, very important that we understand that was a deliberate and intentional move made by Black scholars of the time in order to set, and more importantly, I would say even than, quote, set the record straight, was to say that what you've been told about us is not who we are. This is who we are. And they often signaled that through the use of the word the. So this talk isn't entirely about that, but I wanted to highlight that as significant, because particularly when it comes to African-American historians and African-American scholars of the period that I'm discussing, a lot of what they understood as the task was to address what Black people were told about themselves, thought of themselves, and to present a different viewpoint of the past beyond the sort of Eurocentric white supremacist one. So, and that also becomes key, and you also have to understand part of Woodson's project and Greene's as well. As Degbovie points out, white scholars in other fields supported their racist colleagues in the historical profession. So specifically, you had psychologists, sociologists, a lot of these disciplines that were sort of enjoying their advent or a rise to their zenith during this period. They often leaned on history in particular and historians in particular to justify the racist assumptions that they would make about African Americans, about Black people. So what Woodson, Greene, and others saw when they looked out at the landscape, they said that we need a cadre of intellectuals, a cadre of scholars, a cadre of people doing the work of history to come together and to study and read and research each other's work so that we can be in dialogue with each other to show that there is more to our story than what is initially being put out there. And the next thing I want to talk about is sort of Greene in relation to two other sort of large historical figures of the period, and that would be W.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson. So there are similarities and divergences that Greene has with each of these individuals. And sort of one more thing that I want to state before I move too far is that this particular intellectual genealogy does have a overwhelming representation of a particular type of Black intellectual, right? The cis Black male hetero intellectual who was not by any means ever or will be the only voice on Blackness, the only perspective on Blackness. In fact, we are at a point now where a lot of the most sort of refreshing and forward-thinking work is coming up by Black women scholars, Black non-binary scholars, Black folks who are coming, and this is also a very US-centric presentation as well. A lot of the best work out nowadays is also coming from Black people who are from myriad parts of the world, whether that be the Caribbean or the African continent. So I just wanted to take a quick aside to say that this presentation is by no means meant to be an exhaustive sort of representation or argument about any sort of Black intellectual tradition. Instead, it is a sort of laser focused analysis of a particular set of iterative moments, studies, relationships, and a particular genealogy, not the only Black intellectual genealogy. So I just wanted to sort of foreground that. Now, to the individuals that I wanted to focus on, the three being Greene, Du Bois, and Woodson. Now, with Greene and Du Bois, there are sort of obvious similarities, right? Greene coming from Antonia, Connecticut, Du Bois coming from Massachusetts, both of them having the New England roots, both of them actually saying of their personal experiences that the racism that they encountered on an individual level was not what one may have even expected in the North, but definitely not what one encountered in the South. So both of them grew up around a significant amount of white people as well. So there were quite a few sort of social commonalities between Greene and Du Bois in their early years, where their experiences tend to diverge is along the lines of class and along the lines of sort of familial responsibility, whereas Greene was very much responsible for his family as a financial provider, as a laborer. Du Bois was not. Du Bois's track, in some ways, one could say, was pointing to a academic and university horizon in the way that Greene's may have pointed there as like a pit stop, but not necessarily as a profession. And I'll elaborate on that a bit later. And then if we move to Woodson, the commonalities between Greene and Woodson, and part of what I would sort of humbly speculate drew them together was a shared class background, meaning that both had family members who were connected directly to slavery. Woodson himself being enslaved, but Greene having sort of a very short connection, meaning a very, very close connection in terms of his family and slavery, but also not growing up with a lot of money, not having a lot of resources, having to work. Whereas with Woodson, it would have been the coal mines. With Greene, it was the factory work and different types of manual labor. But both of them knew manual hard work extremely well, and both of them struggled substantially in their early years in terms of finances, in terms of access to particular types of resources. So again, it's mentioned some in the sort of texts that dive into their relationship a bit, but my sense of it is that not only the shared class background, but one of the things that came out of one of the ways that they sort of tackled the experiences that came with such a background was that they both really embraced what they understood to be an idea of, quote, hard work. So I think that is another thing that they also connected on. Sorry. And additionally, another thing that I think is useful to think about, and I kind of talked about this a little bit, but this idea of race vindication is another sort of concept that I think is useful to be aware of when you're understanding the context within which Greene emerges. So to go back to Dagbovie for a moment, when he's talking about sort of the scholars of the time and the period, what he says, and this is in the backdrop of sort of a time or an era that has been sort of described by Rayford Logan as the nadir. This would be 1877 to 1901, which Rayford Logan has sort of discussed in his own scholarship as the low point of, quote, Negro at the time or African-American life in the United States. And this nadir is the era that many sort of Black scholars are either born into or come out of. And understanding that, Dagbovie says that there were sort of African-American, there's the African-American autobiographical intellectual tradition, African-American historians, professionally trained and self-taught, who were, quote, demonstrated an overarching commitment to race vindication by challenging racist historical discourse that upheld the, quote, mental and cultural inferiority of African peoples. They, quote, lived lives that were personal vindications of racist notions about Black people and told the truth about the history and culture of peoples of African descent in the United States and at times throughout the diaspora. So that idea of the race, and what I think, maybe a more sort of popular reference to thinking like this would be understanding that in the 1920s, you have the emergent, in the early 20th century, you have the emergence of an organization such as the Universal Negro Improvement Association in Harlem, which comes about through the work of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And why I sort of bring that up as well is that this idea of vindication was a very salient one that you saw in myriad Black intellectual circles, Black artistic circles, Black social circles. And again, with our sort of, 21st century, second decade context, we might hear words like vindication and corrective, and we may sort of look at them and think about the sort of ways that those projects might seem to us today as sort of limiting or inexact or imprecise. And all of those assessments are true. All of those assessments are right. There's that as something is corrected, another thing emerges that is also a problem. And we also should be critical of ultimately what does it mean to, quote, correct or incorrect. However, in the period that I'm talking about, in the period that we're focused on today, it's very, very key to remind yourself of the fact that at the turn of the 20th century, you have being born, or you have sort of not even being born. At the turn of the 20th century, you have coming of age, the first Black people who were born out of slavery in its sort of formal context, using sort of 1865 as a demarcation for that. Though we know through texts like, Slavery by Another Name, and all of the research into the ways, whether it's Black codes or Jim Crow, we know that slavery has persisted in different forms. However, if we're talking sort of the formal sense of chattel slavery, the first sort of Black generation coming of age, not born into classical chattel slavery. You have individuals who are thinking about not only what does it mean to be Black, but what does it mean to assert one's sense of self, assert one's sense of identity and being, when just 30, 40 years ago, you were folks' property and you were their chattel. And that sort of is why terms like vindication show up a lot in some of the early scholarship. That is why terms like corrective show up a lot in the early scholarship. That is why terms like the genre of Black history text shows up in a lot of scholarship. And I think that we are now sort of at a stage in Black historical studies or Black history or Black studies as well, where we can look back on those moves that were, again, salient at the time and sort of make adjustments, shifts, transitions as we deem necessary. So that's a way to sort of understand a move that was made in the past and how that informs sort of the new and different and more critical moves we make in the future. Another point that I quickly highlight is this idea of what Lorenzo Johnston Greene and Dr. Carter G. Woodson both noticed early on was that they needed a way to attack what they term, quote, popular racism. So racism in popular culture, whether this be minstrelsy, whether this be in media, whether this be in the newspapers, in the postcards, in the silent films, any of the popular discourse at the time. It wasn't just sort of the academic racism that was very pertinent and salient, right? But it was also how could they think about and think through addressing the sort of popular racism as well. So this is one of the things that really motivated the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which, just to sort of bookend, I may refer to for the duration of this presentation as the Association, which it is commonly referred to by Woodson, Greene, Mary McLeod Bethune, and others who led the organization and were a part of it for a substantial period of time. So if I say the Association, that's what I'm referring to. There are also Great Migration connections that we see. Lorenzo Johnston Greene family, like a lot of other families, sort of made their way up to New England in a decision to move from the South. And we sort of see that story playing out actually with his family having connections to Arlington, Virginia, and the Potomac River area of Maryland, and Washington, D.C. So Greene's family made their way from D.C., Maryland, Virginia, or the DMV, as it is colloquially referred to today, made their way from there up to New England, particularly Connecticut. And the draw, the thing that got the family up to Connecticut was the allure of a high-paying factory job. The job that Willis Greene, Lorenzo's father, Dr. Greene's father, enjoyed in Maryland was working for a canal boat. So he operated a canal boat, which paid well, but the allure of a factory job eventually did pull him up to Connecticut. And in terms of his own life, in terms of his own trajectory, it was really a three-part, I would say. There were three potential paths that it looked like Dr. Greene may take. One of them being history, which he ultimately did. The other two, though, being poetry and medical school. And in fact, for the longest period of time, it looked like he was actually going to go to medical school. So the path that his family really wanted him to take, and the path that it looked like he was going to take upon graduating high school. He graduated from high school with extremely high marks. It was noted that he had an acumen for sort of classroom-based education. And the thinking was that what one does when you are able to study, able to learn, and you have a proclivity for this type of research, you, especially coming from a family like his, that was going through the financial hardships that they were, the idea was that he would get a job that would help the family financially the most, with his sort of individual interest being ancillary to that. So as Dag Bovey put it, After Greene graduated with a, quote, exceptional class, his high school principal encouraged him to study law at Syracuse. He didn't do that. His family and other friends of the family encouraged him to study medicine. At the time, medical work was among the most popular vocations of, quote, college-bred Negroes, along with teaching, preaching, secretarial work, and law. African-American college graduates chose these professions during the era of Jim Crow segregation because they could, and equally important, because they felt a sense of duty and responsibility to their community and people. As Woodson noted in The Negro Professional Man and the Community, by becoming a physician, preacher, lawyer, or teacher, the Black professional could give back to his or her community in concrete ways. So despite his love of history and debating, Greene did not follow his principal's advice or his earliest calling. He decided to become a physician, and his decision was not unique. Ultimately, sort of to skip some of the biographical information, obviously Dr. Greene did not end up becoming a medical doctor. He took a winding path that involved some years of non-academic work, some years studying. He couldn't afford to study right away, to go to school. So he had to sort of work a few years to save up. And even when he was able to save up and go to college, the credits he needed for medical school, he hadn't reached that credit requirement right away. So he needed to spend some more time studying. And he went to Howard basically to get the credits that he could in order initially to go to medical school. So the plan was to go to Howard, engage in his studies, and then go on to medical school. While at Howard, he became engrossed in the study of history, really. And even though there were multiple pivots, multiple points, he actually applied to medical school. He actually got into medical school and, was going to pursue this field of study. But the time that he spent at Howard and also at Columbia, ultimately, he found his way, I would say, to tell his family what he wanted to do. And I think that was really tough, because this is a person with an extreme sense of personal responsibility to his family, to those who are around him. But he began to think about, and this is something that's important if you think about how Black people's sense of responsibility became what the National Council of Black Studies today refers to as, quote, social responsibility, and not just individual responsibility. The move that Woodson made, the move that Greene made to be a historian, to study Black history, to not just study Black history, but to be Black history, to live Black history, to sort of live a life in service of Black history and Black people, was that he not only thought about his own sort of individual, quote, nuclear family, as we may think, as we're socialized to think about. He thought about his kin, his folk, his people, and that sort of shift to thinking about the Black community as an entity to which he is both representative and responsible and accountable was in part what moved him ultimately to be a historian, to study Black people, Black life, Black history. And again, another thing similar to Woodson, his path was very non-traditional. It wasn't sort of undergrad, grad school, PhD. It was high school, work for a bit, college, job full-time. Again, these were all manual labor jobs that he had, sawmills, delivery, factory work, while he was in school, while he was studying, while he was becoming educated. So his path was not at all what we're told is like the path. So again, Dr. Greene is another example for folks who are working while you're in school, who maybe are bouncing around to different colleges, who maybe have to take some time off, who have to do things for their families. Here's someone here who did all of that, who juggled, who hustled, who did what he had to do, and did not at all sort of take the traditional path. And I just wanted to say that one's path to study into college can look a lot of different ways. There's more than one way to be a student, more than one way to be a scholar, and it doesn't have to look any particular way, actually. Just has to look the way that works for you. A couple last things from Dagbovie's text, and I'll move on. So Dagbovie goes extensively into what it meant for Greene to study, quote, under the father of Negro history, And he got the job first with the association in 1928. And he was the, quote, the number one staff assistant. He took over after the previous assistant of Woodson's got a job. I want to say, I believe it was Fisk University. It was either Fisk or Lincoln, but I'm pretty sure it's Fisk. His previous assistant got a job at Fisk. So once that assistant transitioned, Dr. Greene came on staff. And another sort of important point to note is that he was offered jobs at different universities at the same time. Fisk, North Carolina A&T, other schools. He was offered jobs to teach there, but he saw something in the mission of the association. He saw something, and again, so this is 1928. This is 2 years after we get sort of Negro History Week coming onto the scene as well, which I spoke about to this audience last year. So that's just something that I think is vital to consider as well. So Greene sort of taking seriously the vision and the ideas of Dr. Woodson, signed up to do this work, signed up to be a part of this. And the two texts that you see here are the texts that Lorenzo Johnston Greene put years and years of life and rigorous study into, one of them being the Negro Wage Earner, the other being the Negro in Colonial America. And the Negro Wage Earner is credited as being written by Greene and Woodson. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that from Greene's perspective, he did a lion's share of the work on that project. If folks are interested in more of the questions about that, we could talk about it then. But one of Greene's sort of consistent interest, I would say, was the class question, but not the class question solely from an abstract or theoretical level. He did appreciate those sorts of sort of serious studies. However, something that remains extremely consistent about Greene is that he was a very sort of pragmatic, practical thinker. And the term wage earner here is not unintentional. He was interested in what the lives, experiences, realities, knowledges were of Black people who earned a wage for a living. And I think as we think about what people choose to study nowadays, what lines of research people choose to go into, it's very telling that the Negro wage earner was a population and a person whom Greene thought deserved time. Secondly, the Negro in Colonial New England, which I'll end with, so I won't spend a ton of time on that now. And the last thing that I would sort of say in terms of his professional life, he spent approximately 40 years, I would say, give or take, at Lincoln University. His new home became Jefferson City, Missouri. He and his wife made a home there. He was also a supporter of the Double V campaign, which sort of emerged out of World War II, in part really being this idea of if Black people are going to go to fight for the freedom of this imperialist state abroad, the least that could happen is that they would get some semblance of freedom at home. So I want to be also, maybe it's useful for me to say that the critique that I personally would levy of any sort of imperialist nation, especially the United States, is that any sort of efforts of war that are carried out by this country are fundamentally oppressive, are fundamentally harmful. And I guess what I would maybe add is that for Greene, his perspective on war was one that was not, we don't have sort of the room to get into now, but he was very much thinking about this from a perspective of the worker, of the laborer. And his mindset was that if Black people are going to go risk their lives overseas, why should they continue to do that for a country that doesn't care about them at home? Again, a sort of multi-generational later extension of that question is why fight for an imperialist nation at all? But again, we're thinking about steps here. But then lastly, sort of the final point that Greene makes or made that I would like to make in terms of Lincoln is that he was a type of scholar. And this is another thing too that I think if we talk about Black intellectual traditions is really, really sort of key to understand is that for scholars like Woodson, scholars like Mary McLeod Bethune, scholars like V.P. Franklin, scholars like Rayford Logan, scholars like Lorenzo Johnston Greene, Black scholars of that era and of that period, for them, they did not just work at a place. So they didn't just work at Howard University. They didn't just work at Fisk University. They didn't just work at Morgan College. Benjamin Quarles did not just work at Morgan College and then Morgan State College, now Morgan State University. They didn't just work at these places. They didn't just labor at these places. They lived in such a way that their work at these places was part of their work in service of Black people, right? Like, so this means that these are folks who were connected not just to the campus, but to the Black people surrounding the campus, the people who worked at the restaurants, the people who worked at the maintenance stores, the people who lived down the road, the families who'd been there for 20, 30, or 40 years. They were a part of the entirety of the place. So it wasn't just a clock in, clock out situation for these Black scholars. When Lorenzo Johnston Greene went to Lincoln University, he went to Lincoln and he changed that place forever. He invested in the fields of study. He invested in the resources afforded to students. He invested in the classrooms, the everything. It wasn't just in and out for them. And I'll take sort of the remaining time to wrap through two texts that I'm not fully going to get into, but I did want to at least start to discuss for you all. So I see that we're at 6:43 right now. I'll probably stop around the 6:50 mark, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So I just want to read some quotes that I have here from two texts. One of them is from a diary, the diaries of Lorenzo Johnston Greene. I'm not going to dive too deep into them, but these diaries were edited by Avara E. Strickland. And what the selling, I wanted to talk about selling Black history because I just find it very, very interesting. Basically, what happened was at the association, at the offices in DC, Lorenzo Johnston Greene and Carter G. Woodson were having a conversation about what they would do with a lot of sort of surplus copies of text that they had, meaning they printed out a lot of the text that the association published, but they didn't have enough people sort of buying them or purchasing them, and the books were going bad. So they were trying to figure out, well, what do we do? And Lorenzo Johnston Greene had an idea, and it was basically barnstorming. It was basically selling Black history across the country in a model way forward, and that's what happened. So just a couple of quotes from Greene about that process. The day that everything happened, he says that he was arriving in Washington at 2:30. I went directly to the office. Excuse me. Woodson was glad to see me and expressed the hope that I had got some much needed rest, to which I nodded assent. He then said he wanted to talk to me concerning the books of the association, which were mildewing in the basement. Then he asked whether I had any suggestions for disposing of them. I responded in the affirmative, but how, he asked. So to be clear, disposing of them did not mean sort of getting rid of them or throwing away. It meant how can we still make sure these books, the ones that are still in good shape, are still in usable shape? How can we get them out to the people? And Greene's idea was to grab a few undergrads at Howard who they could compensate, and they would get in a car and they would go to Atlanta, they would go to Tennessee, they would go to where where Black people were, to be honest, and sell the history of Black folks. It's a pretty amazing story. Greene didn't talk about a ton of instances where there was racial strife on this trip. I'm sure there were some, but one that I wanted just wanted to highlight quickly, he does say that, Greene only expressed misgivings about encountering racial violence when he left Tennessee and crossed into Georgia. Here and there, he mentions hostile stares and a few catcalls from white youth, but the team experienced surprisingly little direct hostility. Greene did inquire of informants at the places they visited about the climate of race relations. And here, it's important to say that they never went any place that they hadn't vetted previously, either through Dr. Woodson directly, his contacts, or someone else they knew on the ground. Where did they go to sell these books? A ton of folks. They went to Black businesses in each of the towns, Black colleges. There's an extensive conversation in the text about Fisk and Tennessee State in particular, and some of the time spent at both of those institutions. There's also anyone who was connected to Dr. Woodson. You got to remember, at this time period, Dr. Woodson's name was prominent, was everywhere. He would be something akin to, his personality was absolutely not that of a sort of popular intellectual that we could think of today, some of whose names I'm sure you already know, popular Black intellectuals. So his personality and his affect and sort of his intellectual get down, for lack of a better word, was not at all that. But in terms of the name being commonplace and known among Black people who thought about these types of issues, Dr. Woodson's name was well known. So a lot of times, all they really needed to do was mention that they showed up on behalf of Dr. Woodson, and the rest was the rest. Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, of which Dr. Lorenzo Greene was a member. Some of the workers, at least majority of the undergrad students who worked with them came from Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, and also fellow Howard alum were people who he'd contact with. Again, having graduated from Howard, a lot of the Black professional class in the cities that they would go to, many of them were Howard alum, so he was able to establish connections there as well. Also, the college presidents and faculty members at the HBCUs in these respective towns encouraged and would really open up their universities and campuses to these men. And that would happen in forms of like helping them with lodging, helping them with food. So it was a really sort of collective effort selling Black history in this way. So to sort of move on, and I'll end with the colonial, there's the Negro and colonial New England. The relationship between Woodson and Greene was one that was mutually beneficial for each of the men, but it's not something that I would describe as a friendship per se. Their relationship experienced many of the ebbs and flows that are commensurate with the pupil-mentor relationships involving a senior scholar and a more junior rising scholar. And again, this isn't sort of the venue or the place for that, but there is quite a bit sort of written about, again, the ebbs and flows of the relationship that they did have. Moreover, quote, for example, like when they went to Tennessee, as I said, they actually weren't that impressed with some of the white schools that they encountered, which was pretty interesting. But they do talk about Fisk and Tennessee State and having sort of great libraries and sort of really nice campus, things like that. Here's reference to the one instance that they do talk about there being some tension around race. And particularly, this is Greene talking about some counsel he received from another African-American in the town that they were in, which says there had been there had been a killing of a young white man in the town recently, and the town was basically on edge because Black people were suspected of having done that. And the person tells him, quote, he fears reprisals. And now this is Greene again saying, Negroes are forbidden to buy guns, or at least white storekeepers are not to supply them. If a riot comes, for God's sake, have the Negroes defenseless in order that the white casualties will be as small as possible. Nevertheless, many of the Negroes, especially the lower element, are well supplied and ready for any emergency. They buy from the Jews, and very fair Negroes buy from the Gentiles, thus putting to good account their preponderance of white blood. I hope, however, that it will not be necessary to resort to the use of arms. And I wanted to include this just because I think there's a ton there. But what's particularly interesting is that Black people found ways to protect themselves even when there was sort of state-sanctioned opposition to them being able to do that. Moreover, Greene keenly points to a term that a lot of people like to throw around today is this idea of, quote, allyship. And I think for what it's worth, personally, the term has a lot of limitations, I would say. But what I do think Greene points to here is that some of the people he referenced, they literally put their money and their resources in their arms where their mouths were. So that's a point of note. I did include, for those who are familiar with Atlanta at all, when they got to Atlanta, something I thought was interesting was they said that they sort of made their way or inquired our way to the Negro Business District on Auburn Avenue. And the fact that Auburn Avenue was a specific place they went to was very, very interesting to me, because that's a well-known site for Black businesses, Black bookstores, Black social life. And it was just very interesting. And I'm going to end with this. I know I'm kind of right at the time I said I would stop. So I want to kind of end with the book that he wrote that focuses on the area where we are. So I'll just read these quotes and then kind of bring it to a conclusion. The first is actually Dr. Woodson's review of this text. And he says that the work is another serious treatment of the history of the Negro, an effort to rewrite the history of the long neglected past of an important element of the United States population. The book, in its plan and execution, shows advanced scholarship resulting from the use of scientific to unfold the truth. New Englanders will be shocked to read some of the discoveries reported by Dr. Greene. So in 1942, what's some of what Dr. Greene reported? One thing is that, quote, the New England slave trade attained its greatest development in the 18th century. Several factors stimulated its growth. The revocation by the British Parliament in 1696 of the monopoly held by the Royal African Company made it possible for all Englishmen to engage legally in the slave trade. Slave transactions were usually executed by deed, though some Negroes are said to have passed from hand to hand without this formality. Geographic conditions also played an important role, since the New Englanders, prevented by climate and soil from reaping rich returns from agriculture, had to look elsewhere if they were to match the wealth of the landed aristocracy of the South. Providence apparently did not become important as a slaveholding community until about 1748. With 225 Blacks, it ranked second, 74 to South Kingstown. By 1782, the number of Negroes in Providence had increased to 285 in an aggregate population of 4,310. And lastly, from New England's many ports, trim, sturdy ships built from her own forest carried to the West Indies much needed food and other commodities such as surplus beans, peas, hay, corn, staves, lumber, low-grade fish, horses, dairy products, and miscellaneous assortment of goods. Now, the assortment of quotes that I've read for you all are just a snippet of the work that Dr. Greene did, but those quotes in particular are the ones I wanted to read because they are really sort of guideposts to much of what has emerged in the 1942, in the 80 years since this text was first published. 80 years ago, there was no text that said these things. 80 years later, you'll be hard pressed to find a text on Black history in New England that does not reference Dr. Greene, whether it is Christy Clark Pujara's text or a host of the other texts that have dealt. Christy Clark Pujara, the author of the text Dark Work, which looks at the business of slavery in this part of the country. Dr. Clark Pujara extensively cites Dr. Greene. He's cited by local historians in the area as well, Keith Stokes, Ray Rickman, a bunch of others. All of these individuals have made effusive reference to the scholarship of Dr. Greene. A couple of things that I mentioned previously that I think are important to note is that he was one of the first to point to the idea of the business of slavery that Dr. Pujara expounds upon, and that Dr. Clark Pujara expounds upon. And he also pointed to two things that I want to highlight and then close. One of them being that his research really, really did a good job of pointing to the fact that the purchase of enslaved people looked different here than it did in the US American South, meaning that he highlights time and time again that just because there were not sort of conventional slave markets or conventional auction sites, such as one may find in the US American South, that did not mean that people were not bought and sold in this area. In fact, he highlights that many of the transactions were done sort of informally at a tavern, at someone's house, on a dock, on a ship. A person who who paid for a ship would tell the captain, bring me back X, Y, and Z, right? The sort of the process that occurred was prevalent. It was taking place. It just didn't look the same as it did in the US American South. Secondly, there's the slide here, and this connects in somewhat to some personal research that I'm continuing to do, which is his highlighting of the fact that Rhode Island really, New England in particular, Rhode Island especially, anchored the entirety of the transatlantic slave trade, meaning that the slave trade as we understood it does not exist without Rhode Island. The other half of his text, I would also be remiss if I didn't say it is not a text that is only about enslavement. It is a text that dives deeply into histories of African meeting churches, histories of African social organizations, histories of Black people making a way out of no way in social life and community, ways of studying. So there's all of that. But what I want to close with is that Lorenzo Johnston Greene really is the forerunner of African American history in New England, and is a name that you have to know if you're interested in the field. My closing words are this: the cause for Greene was always paramount. He remained perpetually and unyieldingly committed to Black people, Black education, and the improvement of the race collectively. And I'll stop now.
Chris, thank you so much. Really interesting. I'm baffled by the title, "The Selling of Black History for." It sounds almost.
For Carter G. Woodson. That part, man. Yeah.
Because we've talked about the commercialization and thus reductiveness of Black History Month, even.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, maybe that's just diction from the 1940s.
Yeah. I think that's what I was gonna say. I think it's more like reading the text. I think that's more a diction thing than anything. Like, and that comes up quite a bit. Like I was kind of alluding before in like how they wrote text and how they talked about it. I think that also his training, Dr. Greene's training, was very literal. Like his training as a scholar, like if you read his text, if you look at the works, so in the way that today we might think about how sort of events like this, like popular events that you may have a webinar with a fee to support the people putting it on, right? Like this is no different than that. You got to also understand that Greene he wasn't getting a lot of money for this. He wasn't, none of this. This was really their attempt to ensure that the history got to the people, because for them, like the books were just sitting. So they actually were like, instead of us just waiting on people to come to us and order these books, how about we just get them out there? And I guess what I didn't get to highlight as well is that when I say the selling, they had a number, but if they actually broke that number down, then the majority of that went either to the association or to pay the individuals who were doing. You could think of it as the undergrad students and Greene who went on that journey. They actually were paid in large part through, that process. So it wasn't, it was by no means, and I guess that's something too. None of these people ever, Woodson, Woodson, Greene, any of them, they didn't make a ton of money for this. Like they again, that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. They could have been, physicians or lawyers, which was the idea for success. So yeah, I think honestly, it looks from my reading of the text. This is also something interesting I'll say is that the term selling is not. That's also that's what the editor reads onto what they were doing, right? That's not like Woodson isn't. I mean, Woodson nor Greene are sort of self-articulating that term, right? That's a term that is sort of put onto it. I'm assuming also some publishing. I assume a publisher wanted to make the text look a certain way. So, yeah, I would just say that it's not something I would read onto them as much as a publishing or editorial decision. I hope that answers it.
Yeah. It makes me think the what you ended with, the fact that he, on one hand, spoke at length about enslavement in the colonial period, and then also included lots of African history and the meeting houses and all that, reminds me again of the discussion that we had last year about the tension between celebration and criticality.
Yeah, I can speak to that, and I think that it particularly for, and again, so the talk today I gave was really trying to focus on a certain period of Black intellectual thought, and a lot of these things have to be sort of understood within a certain historical context. So for Greene in particular, he was, again, it's like where the titles become intentional. The Negro in colonial New England. So he's not just interested, it's not slavery in colonial New England. It's not like oppression and, it's whatever Black, it's that the totality of what the Negro life or the Black life now, was. So I guess that's sort of how these historians tended to understand it. What it is that their view was never just this or that, right? They were, in part, I guess I would say, because these were scholars who were largely interested in, like, the big thing they were critiquing about the Eurocentric approach to history was that it didn't take a totality type of view. It didn't look at like the wholeness of Black life. It reduced Black people to this very sort of to being inferior, to being marginal, to being sort of aside. So a lot of their intellectual projects were in many ways a refutation of that. So that's why you get the celebration, you get the critique, you get the assessment. Like they're trying to give you the Negro life, like they're trying to give it all, which is why you had this period, these decades of these vast works, right? Like of where Black scholars are really attempting to retell their history. It was in some ways for them, they write as if they had just so much to cover, for example, Woodson also viewed the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, ASALA. He thought of it also almost as, I would say, I guess we could think of like a periodical, a gazette. Like he thought of this as something that people could pick up, right? Not like an academic journal like we might think of today. He very much envisioned it as, honestly, the phrase that Greene uses, I didn't talk about this earlier with the sort of barnstorming approach. He says, why don't we do it similar to how, he was saying like how do magazines get their message out there? How do like other, types of publications? Remember, because they were academics, I think, asking the same question a lot of academics ask now, which is, yeah, I wrote this really big book, but it's not getting as much views as this YouTube video or this tech, so they were, I viewed it as the 20th century version of like, how do we get ourselves on TikTok or how do we get ourselves on YouTube? They were just trying to come up with a creative way to reach the people because they themselves were scholars, but they were very clear on the fact that we got to get this stuff in the hands of people somehow.
Sean Moore has a question about the writing of the book by Greene and whether he actually worked in New England archives to write his book. Footnotes suggest that most of what he had came out of the Library of Congress and National Archives, perhaps safer for a Black progressive in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, I could speak to, some of that is, remember, so he's working at the association, which is based in DC. So again, like this is me sort of reading what I know of his biographical and work life into it. I'm assuming that, LOC is not that far from Howard University. So part of me thinks that he would spend a lot of his time there, naturally. Secondly, though, I think again, I wouldn't want to speculate, but he didn't view, this is Greene, does not seem to have ever viewed Connecticut as unsafe. Like, there's not a lot in his writings where he talks about that as being unsafe. He tends to have a view, particularly I think once he goes and teaches in Missouri, he's like, okay, this is, where I'm saying, but I want to be clear, like, racism is pervasive in all of these places. Greene's personal view is not like, the total, like, but it's also, he's from New England. So he's also just more familiar and more comfortable with the area. In terms of, like I said, the footnotes, I saw a lot of similar things. I do sort of also want to point out that there's also reference in terms of him spending, like, so after he graduated from high school and spent a few years working, he was still, I guess the colloquialism we'd use today is self-taught, meaning he still, while he was working a lot of the manual labor jobs, he spent a ton of time in the libraries throughout New England. So I say that part to say is that I don't know what his personal library was. And I also think that it's pretty clear he had working relationships with a lot of historians, in and around the area as well. So just because we don't kind of see it show up there, I think he may have sort of accessed like primary source material. I mean, this is a book that is in some ways like a life's work because he's from the area. He may have accessed things, again, in that period, out of high school, some of his different trips back. But yeah, I noticed the similarity about the Library of Congress, which to me, I would attribute to him being based out of DC. And even though by the time the book is published, he's at Lincoln, he's in Missouri for a while, he's always in some ways a part of DC because of his close work with Woodson.
Okay, Chris, thank you so much. Really fascinating to trace that, as you mentioned, the genealogy from last year with Carter Woodson and the initial conception of Black history. Wasn't it? It started out as a week, right?
Yeah. So just to kind of recap that, 1926, it's Negro History Week, then ultimately becomes Black History Month. So, thank you, actually, Benedict, for bringing that up. So a really important thing to understand is that, and this gets in terms of like Greene and them, I don't know if I didn't say this clearly, but when he got the, and this is me wrapping up, but when they decided to go like put out these books across the country at different historically Black colleges, Dr. Woodson bought a Model A Ford that day. The next day, Lorenzo Johnston Greene took his driver's test, passed, and then got to work. So I say all of that to say that when it was Negro History Week, it was not, and this is kind of what I said before, it wasn't meant to be a sort of sit back and celebrate thing. Like, they view this as like working and getting out there and giving people the history, figuring out what did you learn this past year? What did you study this past year? So they actually, the trips around country, that was all them working in service of Black history. That was them going to Fisk, going to Tennessee State. That was them going to Elon College. That was them going to Shaw and just, putting it out there. So yeah, started as Negro History Week, which was meant to be a week where people reflected on what they learned the previous year based on a particular theme or concept. So for them, Black History Month was not a sit back, let's just celebrate first and all this sort of thing. It was really meant, what did we do the past 11 months? What did we learn? And what do we want to focus the next 11 months on? So it was really an active time for them.
Okay. I want to thank our speaker, Chris Roberts, for yet another eye-opening talk. I also want to invite everyone to join us tomorrow. The final event in our Black History Month lecture series continues tomorrow at 6 p.m. with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., The Destiny of a Dream, with Reverend Glenn S. Leverett, pastor of the Community Baptist Church. And that's an event that is presented in collaboration with the Newport chapter of the NAACP. And remember that this event was postponed from its original date on MLK Day. As you may recall, we had some issues with the numbers and the pandemic. It will include a welcome by James Winters, President, Newport Chapter, NAACP, and introductory remarks by Reverend Paul Hoffman, Pastor, EFC Newport. So please visit our website. And if you're not a subscriber to our channel, by all means. And if you're not a member, come on over and join. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening. And thank you.